If you enjoyed this audiobook, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. A World Ruled by Oracles. Part 1. Fate, Providence, and the Unknown. When Emperor Augustus wanted to know if he should expand Rome's borders, he didn't consult economists or military strategists. He examined the flight patterns of birds. This wasn't superstition. It was the backbone of decision-making for thousands of years. Long before anyone dreamed of calculating odds or measuring risk, humanity faced the same fundamental challenge we do today: how to make decisions when the future remains stubbornly unknowable. Ancient societies developed sophisticated systems for peering into tomorrow, but these systems operated on entirely different principles than our modern approach to uncertainty. The Oracle at Delphi represents perhaps the most famous example of institutionalized fortune-telling in the ancient world. For nearly 1,000 years, Greek city-states, kings, and ordinary citizens made pilgrimages to this sacred site to consult the Pythia, a priestess who delivered cryptic prophecies while in a trance-like state. What seems like primitive mysticism to us was actually a highly organized information network. The priests at Delphi gathered intelligence from across the Mediterranean, processing political, economic, and military data before crafting their deliberately ambiguous responses. Consider how Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, consulted the oracle before attacking Persia in 546 BCE. The oracle told him that if he crossed the river, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged, Croesus invaded and promptly lost his own empire to Cyrus the Great. The oracle's prediction proved technically correct, just not in the way Croesus expected. This example illustrates a crucial difference between ancient and modern approaches to uncertainty. Rather than trying to calculate probabilities, ancient societies sought to align themselves with cosmic order. They believed the future was predetermined, whether by fate, divine will, or natural cycles. The goal wasn't to change outcomes, but to discover what had already been decided by forces beyond human control. Roman augury operated on similar principles, but with more systematic methodology. Before any major decision, officials would observe the behavior of sacred chickens, examine animal entrails, or interpret thunder and lightning. These weren't random rituals. They followed detailed procedures passed down through generations of trained specialists. The augurs held such powerful positions that they could halt Senate meetings or cancel military campaigns simply by declaring the omens unfavorable. This system served important social and political functions beyond fortune-telling. It provided a mechanism for slowing down hasty decisions, created opportunities for consultation and debate, and offered face-saving ways to reverse unpopular policies. When a military commander wanted to retreat from a difficult battle, unfavorable omens provided a socially acceptable justification. Medieval Christianity transformed these practices but maintained their essential logic. Instead of consulting pagan oracles, people sought divine guidance through prayer, pilgrimage, and interpretation of sacred texts. The future remained firmly in God's hands, knowable only through revelation rather than calculation. Astrology flourished during this period, but even sophisticated astronomical calculations served primarily to read divine intentions written in the stars, rather than to predict specific outcomes through mathematical analysis. What strikes us most about these ancient systems is how they eliminated the anxiety of choice while maintaining the illusion of control. By placing ultimate responsibility for outcomes with supernatural forces, individuals could act decisively without bearing the full weight of uncertainty. The rituals and consultations provided psychological comfort and social legitimacy for decisions that might otherwise seem impossibly difficult. These weren't primitive or irrational approaches to uncertainty. They were elegant solutions to timeless human needs. They acknowledged the fundamental unpredictability of existence while creating frameworks for action. Most importantly, they established the principle that uncertainty required systematic response, even if that system looked very different from our modern mathematical tools. Part 2. Custom, Tradition, and Informal Heuristics. While priests consulted oracles and philosophers debated divine will, ordinary people developed their own practical ways of dealing with uncertainty. These weren't elaborate mathematical systems, but they worked remarkably well for centuries. Consider the Venetian merchants of the 13th century. They never heard of probability theory, yet they rarely put all their goods on a single ship. Antonio Gramsci would send silk to Constantinople, spices to London, and wool to Alexandria, all on different vessels departing weeks apart. When asked why, he'd simply say, "My father taught me this way." This wasn't calculated diversification. It was inherited wisdom that happened to spread risk effectively. Banking families like the Medici operated on similar principles. Their lending practices followed strict customs. Never loan more than you can afford to lose. Always know your borrower's family and keep enough gold in the vault to weather 3 bad harvests. These rules emerged from generations of experience, passed down through apprenticeships and family traditions. Lorenzo de' Medici didn't calculate default rates. He trusted patterns his grandfather had learned the hard way. Trade guilds developed elaborate reputation systems that functioned as informal credit ratings. A merchant's word carried weight based on decades of transactions witnessed by other guild members. Hans Fugger could borrow enormous sums across Europe simply because 3 generations of Fuggers had honored their debts. Trust networks replaced mathematical analysis. Rural communities relied on even simpler heuristics. Farmers planted multiple crops, not because they understood portfolio theory, but because their ancestors survived famines by doing so. Village elders advised storing grain for 7 lean years, a custom that emerged from observing natural cycles over centuries. These informal systems shared common features. They relied on collective memory rather than individual calculation. They prioritized survival over optimization. Most importantly, they acknowledged uncertainty without trying to measure it precisely. The remarkable thing is how well these methods worked. Medieval commerce flourished using reputation and custom as substitutes for formal risk assessment. Cities grew, trade expanded, and wealth accumulated, all managed through rules of thumb and inherited practices. But these systems had limits. They worked best in stable, familiar environments where past experience predicted future outcomes. When faced with genuinely new situations, like the discovery of America or the emergence of joint-stock companies, traditional wisdom often fell short. The informal heuristics that sustained medieval society would eventually need mathematical reinforcement to handle an increasingly complex world. Part 3. The first glimmers of quantification. Merchants in 13th century Florence discovered something strange when they began keeping detailed records of their trade transactions. Where religious traditions suggested that prosperity and loss arrived according to divine whim, their ledgers told a different story. Numbers revealed patterns that seemed to follow earthly logic. When Giovanni de' Medici examined his bank's accounts in 1397, he noticed that loans to certain types of borrowers failed at predictable rates. Cloth merchants defaulted less frequently than spice traders. Loans secured by property in established neighborhoods performed better than those backed by assets in newer districts. These early bookkeepers weren't trying to challenge God's authority over fate. They simply wanted better control over their businesses. Double-entry accounting, imported from Islamic merchants and refined by Italian traders, forced them to balance every transaction. This discipline created an unexpected byproduct, mathematical evidence that human affairs followed detectable regularities. Consider the records of the Venetian arsenal, Europe's largest industrial enterprise in the 1400s. Supervisors tracked material costs, worker productivity, and ship completion times with unprecedented precision. Their logs showed that certain combinations of weather, workforce size, and material quality produced consistent outcomes. A galley built in spring with a full crew of experienced carpenters took roughly the same time to complete as another galley built under identical conditions months later. This data contradicted prevailing wisdom. If divine providence truly governed all outcomes, Why did careful measurement reveal such predictable patterns? The tension grew stronger when merchants applied similar thinking to agriculture. Harvest records from monastery estates showed that crop yields correlated with rainfall, soil quality, and planting dates in ways that seemed independent of prayer schedules or religious observance. The most revolutionary insights emerged from early insurance practices. Venetian merchants began pooling resources to cover shipping losses in the Mediterranean. When they analyzed claims over decades, patterns emerged that shocked them. Ships departing in certain months faced higher risks. Vessels carrying specific cargo types encountered predictable hazards. Even piracy, supposedly a random plague, showed seasonal and geographic concentrations. These numerical discoveries created a profound philosophical problem. If human record-keeping could identify regularities in supposedly divine domains, perhaps the future wasn't entirely beyond human comprehension. The idea terrified and thrilled in equal measure. It suggested that careful observation and measurement might offer glimpses into tomorrow's events, a possibility that challenged centuries of religious teaching about humanity's proper relationship with the unknown. Part 4. Challenging divine monopoly over the future. This numerical awakening triggered something unexpected. Not just better record-keeping, but a fundamental crisis of faith. If mortal humans with ledgers and counting boards could spot patterns that supposedly belonged to divine providence, what did this say about the nature of divine control itself? The philosophical earthquake began in monastery schools across medieval Europe. Thomas Aquinas wrestled with a troubling question. If God granted humans reason and free will, why couldn't they use these gifts to study the future? His writings in the 13th century carefully balanced divine sovereignty with human capability, suggesting that rational inquiry might actually honor God by exploring his creation more deeply. This wasn't heresy. It was intellectual permission to probe the unknown. The tension reached a breaking point during the Renaissance. Merchants in Florence and Venice faced daily decisions about which ships to fund, which routes to choose, and which partners to trust. Their livelihood depended on making good bets about tomorrow's events. Were they supposed to pray and hope, or could they study market patterns and shipping records? The practical pressure was enormous. Pietro della Francesca, the mathematician painter, captured this shift perfectly. In his treatise on arithmetic and geometry, he wrote that God had given humans minds capable of measurement and calculation. Using these tools wasn't challenging divine authority, it was fulfilling human purpose. This idea spread through trading cities like wildfire. The real breakthrough came when scholars began distinguishing between different types of uncertainty. Some events, like the exact moment of death, remained in God's hands, but other events, like whether a particular trade route would be profitable, might respond to careful study and planning. This wasn't about replacing divine will with human control. It was about recognizing that humans could engage productively with certain kinds of unknown futures. By the late 1400s, educated Europeans increasingly believed that systematic observation and logical reasoning could illuminate patterns in seemingly chaotic events. They weren't claiming to predict the future perfectly. They were claiming something far more modest but equally revolutionary: that uncertainty itself could become an object of study, measurement, and informed response. This mental revolution set the stage for everything that followed. Once people believed they could engage systematically with uncertainty, the mathematical tools would inevitably emerge to support that engagement. Chapter 2: Gamblers, Mathematicians, and the Measure of Chance. Part 1: Card Games, Dice, and Practical Problems. When the Chevalier de Marais found himself stuck in the middle of an unfinished card game in 1654, he faced a problem that would change mathematics forever. His opponent had to leave urgently, but they had already put serious money on the table. How should they split the stakes fairly based on their chances of winning? This wasn't just polite conversation over brandy. De Marais was a professional gambler who made his living from cards and dice. Every miscalculation meant real losses. He had already noticed something troubling about certain dice combinations that contradicted his intuition about odds. When betting on rolling at least 1 6 in 4 throws of a single die, he usually won. But when betting on double sixes in 24 throws of 2 dice, he consistently lost money. The math should have been similar, yet his purse told a different story. Professional gamblers like Demography weren't the only ones puzzling over these questions. Italian nobles spent fortunes on elaborate games of chance during long evenings at their palaces. A single night could determine whether a family maintained their estates or faced financial ruin. When disputes arose about fair odds or proper payouts, these weren't academic exercises. Reputations, honor, and vast sums hung in the balance. The pressure to find accurate answers drove these gamblers to seek help from the era's brightest mathematical minds. They brought their practical problems to scholars like Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat, not because they loved abstract theory, but because wrong answers cost them everything. A miscalculation about dice odds could bankrupt a nobleman. An unfair division of stakes could destroy friendships and trigger duels. Consider the complexity hidden in seemingly simple games. When rolling 3 dice, getting a total of 10 seems roughly as likely as getting 11. Both require specific combinations of numbers, yet experienced gamblers knew that betting on 10 paid better than betting on 11. They couldn't explain why until mathematicians counted every possible outcome systematically. These weren't trivial pursuits masquerading as serious inquiry. Money created the urgency that pure intellectual curiosity couldn't match. Gamblers needed reliable methods to calculate odds because their livelihoods depended on understanding chance better than their opponents. This practical pressure, not philosophical wonder about randomness, sparked the systematic study of probability. The stakes were often enormous relative to the time period. A single evening's gambling could represent years of income for most people. When Cardinal Mazarin organized gambling parties for French nobility, participants regularly wagered amounts equivalent to modern millionaires' fortunes on the turn of a card or roll of dice. Part 2. Cardano and the First Systematic Analysis. A notorious gambler became probability theory's unlikely pioneer by systematically analyzing the very games that consumed his fortune. Girolamo Cardano lived Danley. Born in 1501 in Milan, he managed to be a brilliant mathematician, successful physician, and compulsive gambler simultaneously. His autobiography reveals a man who wagered away family treasures, borrowed against future earnings, and once lost so badly that he pawned his wife's jewelry to stay in games. Yet this same weakness drove him to create the first rigorous mathematical treatment of gambling odds. Cardano's addiction forced him to think clearly about probability. When you're bleeding money nightly, you either develop better methods or go broke. Around 1564, he wrote the second book, Liber de Ludo Alliae, Book on Games of Chance, essentially a gambler's manual backed by careful mathematical reasoning. Instead of relying on superstition or intuition, Cardano systematically counted outcomes. His approach seems obvious now, but was revolutionary then. For dice games, he enumerated every possible result. A single die has 6 faces, so each outcome has a 1 in 6 chance. 2 dice create 36 combinations. Cardano meticulously cataloged these possibilities, then calculated how many favored particular results. Take the simple question of rolling a total of 7 with 2 dice. Cardano identified 6 winning combinations: 1-6, 2-5, 3-4, 4-3, 5-2, and 6-1. Since 36 total outcomes were possible, the probability was 6 in 36, or 1 in 6. This systematic enumeration replaced gambling folklore with mathematical precision. Cardano understood that frequency mattered more than individual results. He recognized that short-term fluctuations could mislead gamblers, but long-term patterns revealed true odds. A die might show 6s 3 times in 10 rolls, but over thousands of throws, Each face would appear roughly 1/6 of the time. This insight separated rational gamblers from those chasing lucky streaks. The irony runs deep. Cardano's personal gambling habits were catastrophic. He describes winning and losing fortunes, getting into fights over disputed outcomes, and even carrying a knife to gaming sessions. His son became a murderer partly due to gambling debts. Yet this chaos motivated Cardano to develop methods that, properly applied, could have prevented his losses. Cardano's work remained largely unknown for centuries. His manuscript wasn't published until 1663, nearly a century after his death. But his core insight, that chance events could be analyzed systematically by counting equally likely outcomes, established the foundation for probability theory. This contradiction between Cardano's mathematical brilliance and personal recklessness illustrates how urgent practical needs often drive scientific progress. Abstract curiosity rarely generates the intense focus required for breakthrough thinking. Cardano needed better gambling strategies to survive financially, and this pressure produced insights that pure scholars might never have discovered. Part 3. Pascal, Fermat, and the Birth of Expected Value. A simple gambling dispute in 1654 changed how humans think about the future forever. Two French mathematicians figured out how to make fair decisions when nobody knew what would happen next. The Chevalier des Marais, a nobleman with expensive gambling habits, approached Blaise Pascal with a problem that was costing him serious money. When players had to abandon a dice game before finishing, how should they split the pot fairly? If you were ahead when the game stopped, you deserved more than half, but how much more? The question had frustrated gamblers for centuries because intuition alone couldn't provide a satisfying answer. Pascal immediately recognized this wasn't just about gambling. He wrote to Pierre de Fermat, and together they developed something revolutionary. Instead of guessing or arguing about fairness, they created a method to calculate it precisely. They broke down every possible way the unfinished game could play out, assigned probabilities to each outcome, and weighted the potential winnings accordingly. Consider their approach with a simple example. If two players needed just one more point to win and the game had to stop, each player had a 50% chance of victory. Fair split, half the pot each. But what if player A needed 1 point while player B needed 2? Pascal and Fermat mapped out all possibilities. Player A could win immediately, or player B could tie it up, and then either player could win the final round. Working through the mathematics, they determined player A deserved 3/4 of the stakes. This breakthrough introduced expected value, the concept that uncertain outcomes could be reduced to precise numerical calculations. Fermat's combinatorial methods and Pascal's probability trees provided tools that worked consistently, regardless of the specific game or stakes involved. The implications extended far beyond card tables. Insurance companies like Lloyd's of London soon adopted these principles to price policies rationally. Merchants could finally quantify the risks of sea voyages and trade expeditions. What seemed like abstract mathematical exercises suddenly became practical tools for making better financial decisions. Most importantly, Pascal and Fermat demonstrated that human reason could tame uncertainty itself. Before their correspondence, people viewed chance events as either divine providence or random chaos beyond analysis. These two mathematicians proved that even unpredictable events followed logical patterns that mathematics could capture and manipulate. Their work established that fair didn't mean equal, it meant proportional to mathematical probability. This distinction between intuitive fairness and calculated fairness would reshape everything from legal settlements to business partnerships. When you can measure uncertainty precisely, you can price it, divide it, and ultimately profit from it. Part 4. From Gambling Tables to Intellectual Revolution. The transformation that began with dice and cards soon exploded far beyond gambling halls, reaching into courtrooms, counting houses, and philosophical debates across Europe. Lloyd's of London Coffee House became ground zero for this revolution when merchants started using mathematical probability to price maritime insurance in the late 1600s. Instead of relying on gut feelings about whether ships would sink, underwriters calculated risks based on historical data and weather patterns. Edward Lloyd's establishment turned from a simple coffee shop into the world's first scientific insurance market because probability gave merchants a language for discussing uncertainty that everyone could understand and verify. This mathematical approach to chance struck at the heart of medieval thinking about fate and divine providence. For centuries, European culture explained misfortune through religious frameworks. Bad harvests meant God's displeasure, merchant losses reflected moral failings, and natural disasters served as divine punishment. Probability theory offered a radically different explanation. Events could be random without being meaningless, and patterns could emerge without requiring supernatural intervention. The French philosopher Pierre-Simon Laplace later captured this shift perfectly when he declared that an intelligence knowing all forces in the universe could predict every future event through mathematical calculation. Legal systems began incorporating probabilistic thinking into their procedures during this same period. French courts started using mathematical analysis to evaluate witness testimony, recognizing that multiple independent sources increased reliability in measurable ways. English property law adapted to handle probability-based insurance contracts. These changes reflected a fundamental shift in how society approached evidence and proof, moving from absolute certainty toward calculated confidence. The business world embraced these concepts with remarkable speed. Dutch merchants pioneered modern banking by applying probability to loan defaults and investment returns. The famous tulip bubble of 1637 actually demonstrated sophisticated understanding of risk assessment, even though speculation eventually overwhelmed rational calculation. Amsterdam Stock Exchange developed complex financial instruments based on mathematical models of future price movements. Perhaps most importantly, probability allowed people to separate skill from luck in human affairs. A merchant could now distinguish between losses caused by poor planning versus unforeseeable circumstances. This distinction revolutionized concepts of personal responsibility and professional competence. When you could measure the likelihood of different outcomes, you could judge whether someone's decisions reflected wisdom or foolishness. The real breakthrough wasn't technical, it was conceptual. Chance transformed from an unknowable divine mystery into a measurable natural phenomenon. This shift laid the intellectual groundwork for modern finance, where risk and return dance together in mathematical harmony. Chapter 3: Taming Uncertainty in Populations and Portfolios. Part 1: The Law of Large Numbers and Statistical Regularity. Jacob Bernoulli spent decades wrestling with a simple yet profound question. If you flip a coin enough times, will it always land heads half the time? His answer, published posthumously in 1713, changed how we see randomness forever. Bernoulli proved mathematically what gamblers had sensed for centuries. Individual outcomes remain unpredictable, but large groups reveal hidden patterns. This became known as the law of large numbers, and it transformed gambling insights into scientific principles. Think of it like this: you cannot predict which raindrop will hit your window first, but you can forecast how much rain will fall this month. One person's death remains a mystery, but among 100,000 people, mortality follows predictable patterns year after year. London's John Graunt discovered this in 1662 when he analyzed death records from plague-ravaged parishes. Despite individual tragedies appearing random, he found consistent ratios. Roughly the same percentage died from different causes each year. This revelation shocked society. Death, previously seen as divine judgment, suddenly displayed mathematical order. Insurance companies seized this insight immediately. Lloyd's of London began writing marine policies based on shipwreck statistics rather than pure speculation. By 1693, astronomer Edmund Halley created the first scientific life table, calculating that a 30-year-old had specific odds of reaching 60. These weren't guesses. They were mathematical certainties derived from large populations. Governments followed suit. France's finance ministers used demographic data to price government bonds and plan tax revenues. Britain calculated military casualties before declaring war. What seemed like supernatural foresight was actually statistical regularity at work. The magic happens through convergence. Flip a coin 10 times and results vary wildly. Maybe 7 heads, maybe 3. Flip it 10,000 times and you'll get remarkably close to 5,000 heads. The larger the sample, the more stable the average becomes. This principle revolutionized business confidence. Merchants could plan transcontinental ventures knowing that while individual ships might sink, their overall fleet would generate predictable profits. Banks could lend money confidently, calculating default rates across thousands of borrowers rather than gambling on individual creditworthiness. The transformation was profound. Random events that once seemed chaotic revealed underlying order when viewed collectively. This insight gave birth to modern actuarial science, demographic planning, and risk management, turning uncertainty from a paralyzing force into a manageable business tool. Part 2: The Bell Curve, Error, and Normality. Something extraordinary happened when astronomers began measuring stellar positions with unprecedented precision in the 18th century. They expected perfect accuracy, but discovered something puzzling instead. No matter how carefully they measured the same star twice, they got slightly different results. Was this divine randomness or human incompetence? Carl Friedrich Gauss, the mathematical genius studying Ceres asteroid observations in 1801, noticed these measurement errors followed a predictable pattern. Most errors clustered near the true value, with fewer large mistakes occurring symmetrically on both sides. When he plotted these errors on paper, they formed what we now recognize as the bell curve, a smooth, symmetrical bump that peaks in the middle and tapers toward the edges. Pierre-Simon Laplace independently arrived at similar conclusions while analyzing French demographic data. Both mathematicians realized they had stumbled upon something profound. Errors weren't random chaos, but followed mathematical laws. The bell curve described not just measurement mistakes, but seemed to govern natural variation itself. Francis Galton later proved this pattern extended far beyond astronomy. He measured the heights of thousands of British men and found the same bell-shaped distribution. Tall men were rare, short men were rare, but most clustered around average height. The same pattern emerged when measuring intelligence test scores, income levels, and even the size of peas in his garden. This discovery transformed how people thought about deviation from normal. Previously, variations seemed mysterious and unpredictable. The bell curve revealed that differences followed mathematical rules. You could calculate exactly how many people would be exceptionally tall or short just by knowing the average and spread. Insurance companies immediately grasped the implications. If human lifespans followed the bell curve, they could predict death rates across large populations with remarkable accuracy. While they couldn't know when John Smith would die, they could confidently estimate how many 40-year-old men would survive to age 60. The bell curve became the foundation of modern statistics. It suggested that complex phenomena could be summarized using just 2 numbers, the average and the spread around that average. This elegant simplification made uncertainty manageable. Businesses could forecast demand, governments could plan budgets, and scientists could design experiments with confidence intervals. What began as frustration with imperfect telescope measurements evolved into humanity's most powerful tool for taming randomness in everything from quality control to opinion polling. Part 3: Insurance, Demography, and Social Engineering. John Grote stood in a London coffeehouse in 1662, surrounded by merchants arguing about plague deaths and population trends. Unlike his peers who treated mortality as divine mystery, Grote saw patterns in the weekly death records published by parish clerks. He counted, categorized, and calculated. His bills of mortality revealed something extraordinary. Deaths followed predictable patterns across large populations, even when individual fates remained unknowable. This breakthrough transformed gambling into insurance. Edmund Halley, famous for his comet, created the first scientific mortality table in 1693 using data from Breslau. He proved mathematically that life insurance wasn't speculation, but sound business. If 100 healthy 30-year-olds paid premiums, insurers could calculate exactly how many would die each year and price policies accordingly. The mathematics was simple. Collect more in premiums than you pay in claims, with enough margin for profit and unexpected variations. The actuarial revolution spread rapidly. London's first life insurance companies emerged in the early 1700s, followed by pension schemes and annuities. The Equitable Society, founded in 1762, pioneered scientific pricing based on mortality tables rather than flat rates. Their actuaries proved that a 25-year-old should pay less than a 45-year-old for identical coverage, because statistics revealed age-based survival patterns. But numbers soon served darker purposes. Governments discovered demographic data's political power. Prussia's state machine collected birth and death statistics to optimize military conscription and tax collection. Colonial administrators used mortality tables to manage slave populations more efficiently. The same mathematics that protected widows and orphans also enabled systematic oppression. Consider how pension systems reshaped entire societies. Otto von Bismarck introduced Germany's state pension in 1889, setting retirement at 70 when life expectancy was 45. This wasn't generosity, but political calculation. Statistical analysis showed few workers would live long enough to collect benefits, making the program affordable while appearing progressive. Modern social security systems still wrestle with this demographic arithmetic. The ethical implications multiply when statistics guide social policy. Should insurance companies charge different rates based on genetic testing? If mortality tables show certain neighborhoods have higher death rates, should residents pay more for coverage? These questions reveal how converting human lives into probability distributions creates profound moral dilemmas. Risk pooling fundamentally changed economic relationships. Individual uncertainty became collective predictability. A farmer who might lose everything in a bad harvest could share that risk with thousands of others through insurance. This transformation enabled modern capitalism by making large investments feasible despite uncertain outcomes. Yet pooling risks also concentrated power. Insurance companies accumulated vast reserves, becoming major investors and political forces. They could deny coverage to high-risk individuals, effectively excluding them from economic participation. Statistical discrimination became institutionalized through actuarial tables that reflected but also reinforced social inequalities. Part 4. Modern Finance, Diversification, and Market Risk. The leap from pooling insurance risks to managing investment portfolios followed the same mathematical logic that Jacob Bernoulli first discovered centuries earlier. In the 1950s, a young economist named Harry Markowitz sat in a University of Chicago library reading about stock market analysis when a profound realization struck him. Just as insurance companies reduced risk by spreading coverage across thousands of policyholders, investors could reduce risk by spreading money across different investments. Markowitz's insight seemed almost embarrassingly simple at first. Everyone knew about putting eggs in different baskets. But he proved something far more sophisticated using statistical tools developed by Gauss and Laplace. When you combine investments that don't move in lockstep, the overall portfolio becomes more stable than its individual parts. A portfolio mixing railroad stocks with airline stocks, for example, might perform better during economic uncertainty than owning just one type. The mathematics behind this discovery relied on measuring two key factors: expected returns and correlations between different assets. If asset A typically gains 8% annually, while asset B gains 6%, but they rarely move in the same direction simultaneously. Combining them might deliver 7% returns with less volatility than holding either alone. This principle became known as diversification, though Markowitz preferred calling it efficient diversification because random mixing wouldn't work nearly as well. Wall Street initially dismissed Markowitz's portfolio theory as academic nonsense. Practitioners argued that smart investors should simply pick the best stocks, not dilute their bets. But major institutions gradually recognized the power of his mathematical framework. Pension funds managing billions discovered they could achieve steadier long-term growth by carefully balancing different asset classes according to statistical relationships. The evolution continued as financial engineers developed increasingly complex instruments. Derivatives allowed investors to slice specific risks away from underlying assets and trade them separately. A farmer could sell the weather risk from corn crops while keeping the land. Banks could package mortgages into securities, spreading default risks across global markets. These innovations promised greater stability through more precise risk distribution. Yet they also created new forms of complexity that few fully understood. The 2008 financial crisis revealed how interconnected risk transfers could amplify rather than reduce system-wide dangers. The same mathematical tools that enabled diversification also made it possible to concentrate enormous exposures in hidden ways. Modern finance thus embodies both the promise and peril of statistical thinking applied to uncertainty. Mathematical models can indeed tame many forms of risk through careful measurement and distribution. But they also tempt us to forget that some uncertainties resist mathematical capture entirely. Chapter 4: When Numbers Meet Human Nature. Part 1: Utility, Preferences, and the Perception of Risk. The search for a way to measure human desires led economists down an unexpected path in the 18th century. While mathematicians were busy calculating odds and probabilities, thinkers like Daniel Bernoulli realized something crucial was missing from the equation. Bernoulli observed his cousin's gambling habits and noticed something puzzling. His cousin would refuse a coin flip that offered equal chances to win or lose the same amount of money, even though the mathematical expected value was zero. This behavior seemed irrational until Bernoulli considered a revolutionary idea. People don't value money itself, but rather the satisfaction or happiness they get from it. He called this satisfaction utility, and proposed that each additional dollar brings less joy than the previous one. Think about eating pizza. The first slice tastes amazing. The second is still great, but by the fourth slice, you're barely enjoying it. Money works the same way for most people. A homeless person gaining $100 experiences far more utility than a millionaire gaining the same amount. This insight explained why people buy insurance. Insurance seems like a bad deal mathematically, since companies need to make profits. Yet millions purchase it because losing everything would cause enormous pain, while paying small premiums barely registers. The psychological weight of potential catastrophe far exceeds its statistical likelihood. By 1738, Bernoulli had created the first mathematical framework for understanding risk preferences. His work allowed economists to compare different risky situations using utility curves instead of just dollar amounts. A conservative investor might prefer a guaranteed $500 over a 50-50 chance at $1,200 or nothing, even though the gamble has higher expected value. These elegant mathematical models gave birth to modern economics and finance theory. They enabled the creation of portfolio theory, options pricing, and sophisticated risk management systems. Nobel Prizes were awarded for extending Bernoulli's insights into complex mathematical frameworks that could handle multiple variables and time periods. However, these beautiful theories had a problem. They assumed people behaved consistently and rationally, according to mathematical principles. Real humans, as researchers would later discover, operate quite differently. They make systematic errors, change their preferences, based on how choices are presented, and often behave in ways that violate the fundamental assumptions of utility theory. The gap between elegant mathematical models and messy human psychology would become increasingly apparent as economists began testing their theories in laboratory settings. Part 2. Prospect Theory and Behavioral Anomalies. People make mistakes with money that seem completely illogical until you understand the hidden patterns. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky discovered something that would shake the foundations of economics when they started watching how ordinary people made choices about risk and reward. Their experiments revealed behavior that defied everything economists believed about rational decision-making. Take a simple test they ran hundreds of times. They offered people two choices: receive $500 guaranteed, or flip a coin for a chance at $1,000. Most people chose the sure thing, which seemed reasonable enough. But then they flipped the scenario. Would you rather lose $500 for certain, or take a 50-50 chance of losing $1,000? Suddenly, the same people became risk-takers, choosing the gamble over the sure loss. This wasn't random behavior. It was a pattern that appeared again and again across different groups and situations. People felt the pain of losing $100 roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. Kahneman called this loss aversion, and it explained why homeowners would hold on to declining properties for years rather than sell at a loss, even when better investments beckoned. The reference point mattered enormously. A $50,000 salary felt generous to someone previously earning $40,000, but disappointing to someone who once made $60,000. People weren't evaluating absolute wealth levels. They were measuring everything against their personal starting point, their mental anchor. Even stranger patterns emerged around probability. People consistently overweighted small chances of big events. This explained why lottery tickets sold so well despite terrible odds, and why insurance companies thrived selling protection against unlikely disasters. A 1% chance felt much more significant than mathematics suggested it should. These discoveries had immediate implications for financial markets. Portfolio managers who understood loss aversion could predict why investors would hold losing stocks too long and sell winners too early. Insurance companies learned to frame their products around avoiding losses rather than achieving gains. Even government policymakers began recognizing how framing effects could influence public support for identical proposals. The elegant mathematical models that dominated finance suddenly seemed incomplete. They captured the logic of perfectly rational actors, but missed the predictable irrationality that drove real human behavior. Risk, it turned out, wasn't just about statistics and probability distributions. It was about psychology, emotions, and the peculiar ways human minds process uncertainty. Part 3. Markets, Manias, and Model Overconfidence. When crowds start chasing the same investment dream, mathematical models often become the first casualties of mass delusion. The Dutch tulip mania of 1637 offers a perfect example of how sophisticated reasoning crumbles under social pressure. Educated merchants who understood trade and finance convinced themselves that rare tulip bulbs represented rational investments. They created elaborate justification systems complete with pricing formulas based on bulb weight and petal patterns. The mathematics looked convincing on paper, but the underlying assumption that flowers could appreciate indefinitely defied common sense. Fast forward to the 2008 financial crisis, and history repeated with frightening precision. Wall Street's brightest minds had built intricate risk models that treated mortgage-backed securities like any other asset class. Value-at-risk calculations suggested these investments carried manageable downside exposure. The formulas accounted for interest rates, default probabilities, and market correlations with impressive mathematical elegance. What these models missed was human behavior at scale. When housing prices began falling, panic spread faster than any equation could predict. Homeowners who seemed creditworthy in isolation defaulted simultaneously across entire regions. Banks that appeared well-capitalized suddenly faced liquidity crises because everyone needed cash at once. The tragedy wasn't that the models were wrong about specific numbers. The real problem was that sophisticated tools created false confidence. Risk managers believed their spreadsheets captured reality completely, so they authorized leverage ratios that would have terrified previous generations. Complex derivatives allowed institutions to place bigger bets while claiming they had reduced risk through diversification. Consider long-term capital management's 1998 collapse. The hedge fund employed Nobel Prize winners and former Federal Reserve officials who had literally written the textbooks on options pricing. Their computer models suggested their trading strategies carried minimal risk when properly hedged. Yet within months, the fund lost $4.6 billion and required a Federal Reserve orchestrated bailout to prevent broader market collapse. The mathematical models weren't fundamentally flawed in their internal logic. They failed because they treated human behavior as a constant rather than a variable. When fear or greed reaches critical mass, people abandon the rational decision-making that underlies most financial theory. Modern markets amplify these psychological forces through speed and interconnection. High-frequency trading can turn minor price movements into major disruptions within milliseconds. Social media allows investment narratives to spread globally before anyone has time for careful analysis. Meanwhile, increasingly complex financial instruments make it harder for individual participants to understand systemic risks. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where mathematical sophistication enables bigger risks while simultaneously making those risks harder to recognize until it's too late. Part 4. Humility, Judgment, and the Future of Risk. Mathematical models break down precisely when you need them most. This harsh truth emerged during the 2008 financial crisis, when sophisticated risk calculations failed to prevent catastrophic losses that supposedly had microscopic probabilities of occurring. The problem wasn't with the math itself. Value-at-risk models, Black-Scholes equations, and Monte Carlo simulations work beautifully under normal circumstances. They help banks set capital requirements, traders price options, and insurers calculate premiums. But these tools share a critical weakness. They assume the future will resemble the past in predictable ways. Consider long-term capital management, the hedge fund that collapsed spectacularly in 1998. Its founders included Nobel Prize winners who had revolutionized financial theory. Their models suggested their portfolio carried minimal risk. Yet when Russian debt markets crashed unexpectedly, correlations that had remained stable for decades suddenly shifted. Assets that weren't supposed to move together plummeted simultaneously. Mathematical certainty met raw uncertainty, and uncertainty won. This doesn't mean we should abandon quantitative analysis. Numbers remain essential for understanding risk, but they must work alongside human judgment, historical perspective, and honest acknowledgement of what we don't know. The most successful risk managers combine rigorous calculation with storytelling. They ask not just what does the model predict, but what stories could unfold that would break this model. Nassim Taleb's concept of fat tails captures this perfectly. Normal distributions assume extreme events are vanishingly rare. But financial markets, pandemics, and natural disasters follow different rules. Extreme events happen more often than bell curves suggest. The 1987 stock market crash, September 11th attacks, and COVID-19 pandemic all fell outside standard probability distributions. Smart organizations now practice scenario planning alongside statistical modeling. They stress test their assumptions against historical disasters and imagine new types of crises. Central banks model not just expected inflation rates, but complete economic breakdowns. Airlines plan for not just typical weather delays, but volcanic ash clouds and terrorist attacks. The ethical dimension matters too. Risk decisions affect entire communities, not just shareholders. When financial institutions take excessive risks, taxpayers often pay the cleanup costs. When pharmaceutical companies rush drug approvals, patients bear health consequences. Risk management requires considering whose welfare hangs in the balance. The story of risk remains unfinished. Each generation faces new uncertainties that challenge existing tools and frameworks. Climate change creates risks that have no historical precedent. Artificial intelligence introduces possibilities that current models can't capture. Cyber warfare threatens infrastructure in ways previous generations never imagined. Future risk managers will need better tools, but they'll also need wisdom their predecessors developed through hard experience. The most important lesson may be the simplest. Stay humble about what you don't know, because that's where the next crisis is hiding.